If you're not a native speaker of the language that you teach, how do you maintain your proficiency and confidence in speaking that language? Today's episode is a leveling up episode where I coach Stephanie, a middle school teacher in Maine. Maintaining and improving her personal confidence and proficiency is the area where she wants to level up. So let's start the conversation. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and you know that I always like to start by reminding you that you are an incredible language teacher. Look at what you're doing. You're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So thank you very much for listening, but even more than that, thank you so much for just being that dedicated teacher that you are. So this is a leveling up coaching episode where I speak with a teacher that's looking to level up in some area and improve and get over some challenges in something that's happening with their teaching or something about teaching in general. And so this week, it's a little bit of a different conversation that I had with Stephanie, who is a teacher in Maine. She's a French teacher in Maine. And normally when we talk about our leveling up and our coaching, I'm talking to teachers about their student-facing experience in the classroom with how they are teaching, what they're doing with their lesson plans, how to get students to do things in a different way. But in this episode, it's slightly different because it's a lot more teacher-facing than actually what's happening with students. So what we're going to look at in this episode is very specifically how Stephanie is approaching her own language skills. And this is something that I often hear from teachers, and I get the question once in a while, and it's even been suggested for a podcast episode, that how can teachers maintain their own language skills while teaching? And this is the area that Stephanie wants to focus on. And as we will hear from her, that a lot of times it ends up being in speaking with other language teachers where this seems to be the most challenging, that when speaking with other native speakers or other speakers of the language, that it's not as challenging for her, but something happens when it's with other teachers. But the other thing that we will see, which is common, is that Stephanie teaches lower level classes, meaning like those level 1, level 2 classes. And that means that she spends her day speaking at the novice level and making language comprehensible at the novice level, whereas an AP teacher or higher level high school teachers are using much more sophisticated language and they're keeping their language chops up, so to speak. Whereas that's a little more challenging when you're teaching elementary or middle school and you have those lower levels that you're teaching. And this is the situation that Stephanie finds herself in, is how do you keep up that confidence and your own proficiency when the majority of your day is spent speaking at a novice level? So to hear from Stephanie herself, you can hear how this sometimes is an issue for her when it comes to teaching with other teachers, and sometimes this can hold her back from being her best teacher self, to use her words.
As far as in my classroom, I feel like that I've got that now after 27 years, and I can go to workshops and learn a little more and keep that going. But it is the fear of speaking in French with colleagues, with other teachers, that really is what's holding me back, I think, from being my best teacher self.
We go on to hear from Stephanie that it's these situations with other teachers in particular where it doesn't feel like she has the confidence and proficiency to engage, and that could possibly be coming from reactions she has from those conversations or just not having them available to her often enough to keep her confidence up. But this does tend to happen, as she says, while she's engaging with other educators rather than in just using the language with somebody who's not a teacher.
I'm seeing that more personal in my class. I'm very comfortable. If I make a mistake, I can always restate and correct. And they're middle school students, and really, but it's coming in contact at conferences. In my professional life with other teachers that speak French and would know if I made a mistake, and teachers who know who I am and would expect me to have a certain level of proficiency and a certain knowledge level of something that I teach and something that I put so much of my time and effort into.
It is interesting to hear from Stephanie that she tends to have these less than positive experiences with other teachers. And then for that reason, that she tends to use opportunities outside of education and communicating with other teachers to practice her language skills. We would hope that it was a little different than that, but it seems that that's not the case.
I don't hesitate when I speak to people outside the profession because I know I may never see them again. So if I make a mistake, it's not a big deal. I'll find someone to speak to who's not a teacher because then I can practice without that fear of judgment.
In listening to Stephanie's story and her teaching experience, I began to see this through line that she does spend the majority of her day making language comprehensible for her students at a novice high, maybe intermediate low level, which means that that's the language that she accesses on a daily basis to make herself understood and to communicate. And this is the question that I often get from teachers who are looking for advice or just different topics to talk about on the podcast is, I don't teach a high level of language, so how can I be keeping up my own personal language skills when I don't have that opportunity on a daily basis the way that teachers of higher levels of language have? And you can hear in Stephanie describing her classroom situation and her own language journey that this does seem to be, in fact, the case for her.
For level 1 that I teach, I'm really good at level 1. It's having to think of things that are topics that I'm not teaching, and having to stretch in conversations about pedagogy, for example, knowing that kind of vocabulary in the language, or even talking about politics or something that's not something I usually talk about. I find that I lack the vocabulary. If I have the vocabulary in front of me or some kind of preparation, it's a lot easier. And I think that's what I carry over into my classroom. I don't want my students to ever feel in that situation. So I provide a lot of scaffolding and chat mats and things so that they have the vocabulary and can play with it and put it together. But you don't have that all the time in a professional setting. You can't say, can you stop for 1 minute so I need 2 minutes to think right now how I'd answer that, what vocabulary, because I haven't used that word in years, or I don't even know that word. If I look it up, oh yeah, I know how I could put that together. If I have time to prepare, I'm pretty confident. On the spot, I freeze.
Stephanie goes on to tell us how this actually impacts her daily use of the language. And in fact, we actually were at a conference together this past summer, and I was having a conversation with Stephanie, and you'll hear what happened.
Like when we were in that conference together, and we had to do a turn and talk thing, and you started in French, and I said, can we just do this in English? Because I knew I didn't have that reflection time to think, okay, this is what I want to say, because I don't talk at a level like that every day. I just don't have that experience. And I don't even see our high school teachers. I see them twice a year. So I'm never really in that situation that I have to challenge myself or push myself. And in class, I can go slow because the students need to be slow, and I can think. Going slow, I have time to think. But in real conversations, there's no time for reflection.
Before we move the conversation onto suggestions and figuring out some ways of moving past this, given the novice experience every day, but wanting higher proficiency language, before we move on to those suggestions, I always like to find those empowering moments. So I wanted to know from Stephanie, where are those moments where you have been comfortable and confident in using your French? And it turns out that she had one of these experiences this past summer in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, when we were both at the AATF conference.
The community there was awesome. I was able to interact with, store clerks and people in the streets. We bumped into a man who was German, and he had married a Quebecois woman and had moved obviously there, and his wife had passed away. He was an older man, and a friend and I sat there for 2 hours talking with him. He wasn't a native speaker, but obviously he'd lived there long enough that his French was really good, and we had fun. It was great to make him laugh and him to make us laugh.
So as we begin to dive into some ways of leveling up this situation and this experience, I wanted to know specifically from Stephanie, what has she tried, or what are those things that are getting in the way or causing those obstacles?
Well, a lot of it is time. I'm a mom of 4 kids. I have recently stopped taking care of my mother. She's now in a nursing home, but I did that for 10 years. So my time is very limited. I read every day in French. I listen to podcasts. I do a lot of listening and reading. Sometimes I write. I found a great app, or is it it's a bot. And it's called Jam, and it's somehow through Facebook, and it asks me a question every day, and I respond, and it asks me more questions, and we go back and forth, but it's not speaking. Finding the time to make those connections and talk with other teachers.
So now that we're able to zone in on some of the reasons for these obstacles, for this confidence and proficiency and interacting with other teachers, I wanted to know from Stephanie, what are maybe some options in and around where you live or virtually that you may have considered that we can look into even further?
Yeah, I actually found a great one. It's called Cher Ami. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And it's where you sign up to be a language partner with somebody in a nursing home in France. And you exchange for 3 months, but you have to be 18 to 35. I've hit a lot of the demographics where a lot of these things are I'm too old for. We do have an Alliance Française, and they have some great things, but typically they're either during the day when I'm teaching. I just need to find, I think, something online that I could get on when I could get on, and I'm not tied to a certain schedule.
So it does seem like that time piece often gets in the way of all of our lives with so many things that we want to do. And one of the suggestions that I put out to Stephanie in this conversation was to look at her state language association or other language associations that are providing opportunities for language teachers. And Stephanie hits on a good point about a lot of PD for language teachers, that even when it's in the target language, the focus is not on maintaining your skills and your proficiency, but actually on teaching, which is important, but they're not necessarily the same type of PD that teachers need.
And I find a lot of programs for teachers, even if it is in the language, it's about teaching. It's not about helping them improve their language. Not that I don't need help with my pedagogy. I mean, I always like to learn and do that, but I also need help with my language. And I think there are a lot of people who would become language teachers if they could get that kind of support as well.
So just to reiterate that there are many state language associations that offer immersion weekends, immersion programs, and partner situations across your state, or even regionally and nationally, where you can find opportunities to interact through Zoom or even in person, virtually, and have those interpersonal conversations, which are often difficult to come by. I know that particularly state language associations are always looking for ways to support language teachers. And if something like that isn't happening in your state, it's definitely something you can search for, look for, and suggest to your language association that they may be able to do that and support teachers in that way as well. One of the suggestions that I made to Stephanie is that she could possibly partner with a teacher in the high school in her district, where where she could possibly teach one of the units for one of the classes at a level 4 or 5 AP, and that teacher could teach one of her 7th grade classes perhaps. So they could both have those situations because, as she pointed out, she doesn't have those opportunities to engage with the language at that level. So that could be an interesting opportunity for that teacher to really dive into what comprehensible input looks like at a beginning level and have that opportunity for Stephanie to engage at the higher level with language. And this idea really piqued her interest.
That's something I might actually try. The teachers have been there for years. I've had all those students. Like I'm the only French teacher at the middle school. There's 2 French teachers at the high school, one that does, 2 and 3 and one that does 4 or 5 AP. We share those kids and I always hear about them. They'll send me messages. So the kids would not be new to me. I wouldn't have to worry about that connection.
So bringing it all together after this conversation, what were Stephanie's takeaways?
It's just a matter of having the mindset of finding those opportunities and trusting myself.
What insights or inspiration did you take away from that coaching session? If you want to dive deeper into your own teaching practice, consider joining me for a Leveling Up episode. Just click the link in the show notes and we can set it up. You'll also see a link while you're there for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.